Welcome to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. Our podcasts are designed to bring a conversational exploration of key topics that we believe will provide value and insight to those serving in the nonprofit sector. We will highlight new developments in the field, latest research, and things we're learning from our own clients that we can share.
I want to thank everybody for joining us with this month's Calibration Point Podcast. Excited to have Paul Linge back with us again, but we have ventured a lot of topics with Paul around leadership development and understanding leadership growth and challenges. And this month, we are going to focus on a very interesting topic, which may seem out of place at times, but I think as we unpack it, you'll see that it really is in place. And that is exploring bitterness catalysts in the workplace. And Paul is the director of Crossroads, basically their counseling area and counseling center, but also an executive coach. So, as we've talked before with Paul, he gets to see both spectrums on these topics. And so I'm excited. Paul, thanks for taking the time to be with us and exploring the topic of bitterness in the workplace, something that I deal a lot with. I know you deal a lot with. Mm-hmm. Help us maybe just start us out with a tag on that. Like when you think of bitterness catalysts in the workplace, what does that mean?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Great to be with you again and with your listeners. So one of the analogies or a word picture I think is helpful, and I may have used it even on this podcast before, is the picture of driving down the interstate in a car and looking out the windshield, if you're the leader of an organization, if you're in a relationship of some type, as you look out the windshield, you hope that there's a good destination you're heading to. You hope that you're on the right pathway. You hope that there's a brighter future through the windshield. But in the rearview mirror, there's a trailer attached to the car that's slowing you down. And I think one of the biggest weights on that trailer in life can be bitterness that we carry. We might call it unforgiveness, but I think, certainly in biblical terms, bitterness is a term that we come up with repeatedly. And so when it comes to it almost seems like an odd topic, right, to talk about in terms of organizational leadership when we're talking about efficiencies and best practices and those kinds of things. But bitterness can be kind of a quiet, slow poison in an organization that really robs people of things like efficiencies because they go around one another rather than going to one another. And if we're not careful, it can really be kind of an all-consuming thing that causes ruminating thoughts. And bitterness could be targeted. It could be targeted toward a coworker, could be toward a parent, could be towards like a previous abuser or something like that. So there's a lot of different targets as well as sources from which our bitterness can come.
So let's just start with the easy, maybe not easy, but I guess more of a superficial evaluation, then go deeper. So if I'm a leader in an organization, what am I looking for to know whether, and maybe it's all the same. So here are the kind of things that I'll hear is, I'll have someone talk about, okay, well, that person has a real bias to default to being attacked or default to insecurity. And, you hear these kind of narratives come out of how they describe less than desirable behaviors. How do you begin, if you're a leader or a team leader, executive director, or whatever it might be, in looking at what you're seeing in your culture from your team and starting to differentiate between, okay, that's just a bad habit someone has, as opposed to, okay, there's maybe a bitterness catalyst that's triggering that person to now default into that mechanism of whatever it is that I might see in my organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I want to give you 3 diagnostics to kind of identify bitterness as well as an antidote to it. So I want to give a solution as well. First, if I could, I just wanted to read a brief verse from Scripture. This is Ephesians 4, and it says...
And this would be from the Bible?
Yes, from the New Testament. Ephesians 4:31, it says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you." And as we read that, I'm like, that sounds like a pretty good motto for a for an organization or an HR policy or a
Right.
employee handbook, right? So the three kind of, I think, things to look for, and this comes from Stephen Vyer's book, Overcoming Bitterness. And
Okay.
Stephen Byers is a pastor at a church up in West Lafayette, Indiana. I visited his church. I've met him, and it's a great book. But Overcoming Bitterness, Stephen Vyers, Viars is his last name. And one of the three things he points to is the poison of a bitter lifestyle, just like observable behavior. Sometimes it's even observable, and we've probably all seen this on a person's facial expression. Bitterness kind of gets etched in. It gets kind of, you might say, just carved into a person's expression over time. And it almost becomes this permanent scowl or this permanent facial expression. And left unattended, just a bitter lifestyle can really lead to just more and more anger and just chaos in a person's life. So that's one thing. A second thing is the power of a bitter heart. Proverbs 14:10 also in the Old Testament says, the heart knows its own bitterness. And it's helpful to think of it this way, that bitterness is not cooked in a microwave. It's cooked in a crock pot, usually over a long period of time. It's usually not something that just flares up. It's something that we carry. And as a person, an employee, somebody in a nonprofit, when we listen and we hear them replaying over and over the frustrations, the betrayals, the rejections, the offenses, then we see that there's evidence of a bitter heart, right? So that's different from just having a bad day. When those things keep getting replayed over and over and unable to let go of. Then the third one is what you might call the presence of bitter conditions. And we've probably all experienced this to some degree. Maybe we didn't get into that college we'd hoped for, or go to, or things didn't work out like we hoped. A relationship fell apart. You were misunderstood or mischaracterized. So there's circumstances that can lead to bitterness as well. We see that certainly scripturally, and we see that in our own lives. And I think, there's kind of two ditches to avoid when it comes to bitterness. On the one hand is what you would call just kind of like stuffing it all down and kind of holding it all in and being silent and ignoring kind of the pain or the circumstances we've been through in life, because it eventually leaks out. So that's one ditch. The ditch on the other side is you might call oversharing, where people are just kind of unfiltered in their bitterness, and it comes out, and it makes us kind of feel uncomfortable when somebody kind of does that, right? It's like, wow, there's something is off here. And so those are kind of like the three things I would say a leader can look for, whether they're self-diagnosing, gosh, do I have bitterness in myself? Or when they're looking at the culture of an organization to say, man, and I think we've probably all seen it. We've experienced it. We just maybe have trouble naming it sometime.
Right. So we see in organizations, and I use this as an example a lot, because we do a lot of the work we do is the organizational change and organizational culture change. And so I'm curious if you think this comes from bitterness. So one of the things that I see fairly commonly when we're going through a change process with an organization, and I use this kind of quote to leaders to let them know that just because change is leading to something healthy, we have to understand that there are individuals that may become very comfortable with toxicity and dysfunction, and would prefer to stay in that dysfunction, as yucky as it might be, as opposed to going through the change process to something healthier, because that dysfunction creates more safety for them. Can that be also a piece where bitterness has settled in an organization and they've created a pocket around their own bitterness in a way to protect that?
Yes. And I think there are some personalities, and this is where I think leaders have to be wise. Certainly a lot of people can grow and learn and be dislodged from a place of bitterness. The vast majority of people can be. But there are some personalities that almost feast upon toxicity, that almost feast upon,
Right.
you can clean up everything in their lives, clean up every crisis, solve every grievance. And the next day there will be a new batch to deal with.
Mm.
And so, because, and part of that can be driven by a yeah, but, and then referring back to old offenses, old grievances,
Right.
something that are just going to re-agitate the person and re-agitate the environment. And when you're dealing with something like that as a leader, I think that's when, as Pastor Gary Thomas writes in the title of his book is, when to walk away. Sometimes there's a time to walk away and to separate.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is your experience with staff members, team members, leaders, and organizations that are stuck in kind of this bitterness catalyst where it keeps getting triggered? I guess the next question I would have is, and I try to make sense of, let's say that I have a staff member or a team member, and I believe that they have really strong blind spots. And I try to, in my logic, not being in a place of bitterness is, okay, I've talked to them about that blind spot, whatever it might be. Maybe it's how they hear things or what they do, etc. But they don't move past it. So I apply my logic to them. And I have these a lot of times in coaching meetings where I'll have a person as a team or an organization. It's like, hey, I've talked to them about this and they're not changing it or they're not seeing it. I think it's a blind spot. Like when I'm working with them, they think that it's just part of how that person leads. And so they get kind of stuck in this place of they're not willing to be really candid with the team member because they think it's just how they want to be. Then the other side of that is when I meet with the staff member, it's often a blind spot that they're not aware of, but they keep triggering themselves back to it. And they don't know how to keep going back into that cycle. And, when I talk with them, a lot of what you're saying I hear in these meetings is, okay, well, yeah, they tried that and didn't work. Or, yeah, they said that before. In that kind of the narrative, they can't disrupt the narrative of the tape. Is that a bitterness situation often?
Yeah. And in fact, there's a biblical term used like a bitter root judgment or a bitter root expectation. And we see this happen in marriage a lot, like in marriage counseling, where like if husband and wife are sitting in my office, one will say, I knew he was going to say that. He always does that, right? Even though maybe he hasn't even finished his sentence. Or, well, there you go. You ran another red light because you always run red lights. And it's like, no, it was on the tail end of green. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We've made these kind of predetermined judgments against another person, often that comes from a place of bitterness that it's really hard to get out of that, and somebody almost adopts a belief about a coworker, about another person that it's hard to get dislodged from. And so yes, I definitely have seen that. And that is, and I think organizationally, and I say this a lot, in terms of the culture of an organization, it is shaped not by the values that we articulate, but by the behaviors that we tolerate. So I think when a leader's obligation, and this is hard, this involves probably a series of some crucial conversations. When we spot it, we got it, but it doesn't, and there's some coachable, teachable employees that can be led out of a place of bitterness for sure.
Right.
But there are some that if they don't, then, that's probably a different conversation, because it ends up, kind of being a difficult dynamic for everybody to work around, usually over a long period of time.
Interesting. So to that perspective, let's say that I'm a manager, executive director in an organization. I identify this cycle in someone. Do you see that as a leader, I can develop bitterness towards that team member who may be stuck in a bitterness cycle? Does that make sense? Like,
Yes.
can bitterness spawn bitterness?
Yes, yes, it is contagious. Right? Yeah, it may be the new epidemic, right? The new pandemic of 2024 and beyond. Yes. So, which kind of brings me to what's the antidote, right?
Right.
What's the answer? What's the solution? Because I think a lot of people, and including your listeners, we can all identify, you know, maybe some degree or some season of bitterness in our own lives. And nobody likes to live there. It's unpleasant. We
Right.
want to be free. We want to have joyful thoughts and not ruminating, negative thoughts. Real quick, I'll just give a couple like just
Yeah.
biblical names like Naomi from the Old Testament. We see her in the book of Ruth. She's coming back from the land of Moab. She's lost her husband. She's lost her two sons. And so she's returning with her two daughter-in-laws. And some people that knew her from before say, "Hey, look, isn't that Naomi?" And her response is, "Don't call me that. Call me
Yeah.
Mara,
Right.
because I'm bitter because of the circumstances that life has dealt me." And I think we can all
Right.
look at it and go, yeah, she's a widow. She's lost her two children. I mean, we get it. I think about Job and all that he lost in circumstances. I think about Jacob's kind of prophetic word about his son Joseph. He says how Joseph was shot at with bitter arrows, and
Mm.
Joseph is one whose sons sold him, or his brothers rather, sold him into
Right.
slavery.
Right.
Um, Esau was another one who was bitter against Jacob, and he exchanged his birthright for a bowl of soup. And so we see all of these examples, and I think and I realize that your listeners maybe come from a variety of different, maybe places in their faith or a faith
Right.
background. But one of the things that I found the most helpful thing I found in my life is to follow the biblical prescription of biblical lament.
Hmm.
And I'll explain what that is in just a moment. But I think we make the mistake sometimes as if for God-fearing people, it's like, well, I don't want to complain against God about my circumstances, because the Israelites did that and things did not go well
Right.
for them, right?
Right.
And yeah, some of them got swallowed up by the earth or they got incinerated, right? It's like that's not a good
Right.
thing. But nor is it a good thing, kind of like I explained before, the two ditches. So it's not good to be overly expressive, but it's not good to stuff it all down. But the Bible is full of these examples of lamenting circumstances. About a third of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. There's an entire book that Jeremiah wrote called Lamentations.
Right.
And so we see this presenting of kind of these two things. Like, and biblical lament is basically saying, on one hand, Lord, I love you, I trust you, I believe you. And and at the same time, here's my circumstances, and they're really hard. They're difficult. I don't like it. I don't know the way out. Some good passages, David writes this in Psalm 13. He writes, "How long, O Lord, are my enemies supposed to triumph over me?" But then he
Right.
kind of resolves it, says, but I trust in your unfailing love. So it almost feels weird, right? It almost feels bipolar in a way. It's like, because we're saying these two things to God at the same time. My favorite method of lamenting is journaling. I have
Mm.
lots of journals that I've filled with just my thoughts, and there's something, distinctly therapeutic, at least for me, of getting the emotions of the heart and the thoughts of the mind out through the tip of a pen onto some
Right.
paper. And it's exactly what David did when he wrote his Psalms of lament, and other biblical figures write out. That's why there's a fair amount of scripture that is lamenting before God. And so I believe that's the prescription that we have, that it's okay. We're not complaining against God. We're just saying, Lord, I need some help with these circumstances.
Yeah.
It's
That's
amazing
great.
how infrequently we do that at times. We try to just figure stuff out on our own. You know?
And that's a good point. I mean, the idea of we spot a problem and try to solve it, as opposed to stepping back and just breathing with it and then discerning and sense making through it. And yeah, we have one of our large organizations I've worked with, the senior leader of this organization used to always say, people are messy and we're full of mess. And it's such a good perspective and goes in line with what you're saying is that, we have to maybe think differently about how we help people navigate and be, I think, as the leader that's responsible, we have to also step back and make sure that we're not jumping to quick assumptions and now get stuck in the process of I got to fix the person, as opposed to step back and understand what maybe is happening with this individual before I jump into I got to fix what I'm seeing kind of mode. And that, at least in my experience, is really hard for leaders and organizations, at least in the nonprofit space, because they typically aren't creating enough margin for them. Not that they don't desire to, but there's not enough margin for them to be able to take that latitude and be able to step back and not feel like, oh, I got to react and now I got to solve this issue. Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think nonprofit leaders are under a tremendous amount of pressure right now. I mean, there's always the pressure of donor development. There's the pressure of operational excellence and just all these pressures. And it takes time. It takes a little bit of time to step back, to exhale, to get under a good light with a good pen and an open journal and to write down what is going on inside of me. And but I do believe that practice of lament it's so helpful and it's so, cathartic to do. I know that Abraham Lincoln was known for writing 2 letters. He would write letter number 1, draft number 1 of what he really wanted to say to someone,
Right.
Maybe somebody in a congressman or somebody that he had a beef with. He'd crumple it up, he'd throw it in the fire, and then he would write letter number 2. And so there's something to be said about getting these emotions and thoughts out on paper in the safety of the quiet of your own home under a good light, and then being able to formulate your thoughts for when it's time to actually take action and to do something.
Yeah.
And you've disarmed and you've de-weaponized maybe the emotion that would work against you because you've already kind of dealt with it. And so I think for leaders, that I hope that's helpful. Now, when you spot bitterness in an employee, I don't think we can, demand of them, hey, go home and journal about this, right?
Right.
You can suggest it, certainly. But I think, it certainly as a starting point, leaders should, make sure that there's not something inside them that's fueling any type of bitterness culture in the organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's a great jumping off point, I think, for us to really make sure, first and foremost, as a leader, no matter where I'm at leading in my organization, what position, that I'm not enabling or fueling bitterness in team members, in staff members, volunteers, whatever that might be, to make sure that I'm not the catalyst, which, going back to even just the title of what we were talking about here, of that cycle that could be in place.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good point. And I like your idea of the antidote of being able to come back to, do we know how to lament, take time? Doesn't matter what worldview I hold, the idea of lamenting, as you put in the book of Lamentations, understanding that process is really critical. Again, no matter what biblical or non-biblical worldview I hold, there's a lot of wisdom in that understanding. And I'll close with just one thing you reminded me of, and that was Mark Twain had a saying that was, if I had more time, I'd have written less. And there's such value now listening to you and thinking about even Abraham Lincoln. Like, if being able to take the time to write what I think I would say, and then being able to start over and write now how I'm going to translate that to the individual.
Yes. And I think I've found it certainly to be personally helpful. I know others that have done it as well. Lamenting or lament journaling, you might call it. And it's very therapeutic, very cathartic, and probably very preventative, right?
Right.
Because otherwise we end up just reacting to things that we haven't really processed. And maybe a good way to look at it is it's a good process filter for our thoughts and emotions before we take action. I think any good leader would agree. Yeah, that's something worthwhile to do.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective. And I think we can all agree that we need more people with filters.
Right. Exactly. Well put.
Paul, we so appreciate it. Really unique topic. And it's so important in whether I'm volunteering or whether I'm on a board or whether I'm a leader in an organization or a team member in an organization. Thank you for taking your time to explore bitterness with us. So appreciate you.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. If you have comments or ideas for future episodes, please reach out using the contact page on our website, jdlevyassociates.com.